Evening, everyone. Lovely to see you. I trust you're all coffee and caked out. But I must say, it's lovely to see so many of you here this evening. We have these events occasionally on a Sunday evening here in the church. We call them the living room. For obvious reasons, we try to sort of create a slightly more relaxed atmosphere. Because we're conscious, if we're really honest about it, a lot of folks sometimes find coming along to a church building a little bit unusual. And so we try to have evenings like this, if you like, to make the Christian message as accessible as possible. And we really want you to feel at home tonight and welcome here. We're just so glad that you're here tonight. We also call it the living room because obviously at the heart really of what we're talking about, we believe it is something real and something living and something very wonderful. And we are just so delighted as a church that we've got Gareth Davies with us this evening. I only had the privilege of meeting Gareth face to face anyway on Monday, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and we got on like a house on fire straight away.
Well, there was cake there as well, so it helped.
It does help to oil fellowship, doesn't it? But we're really glad to have Gareth here. Gareth's got a great story, and one of the things we like to do with the living room is really to hear somebody's story, to hear their journey. And that's basically why we're so glad that you're here tonight, Gareth. And I know you're willing to be accessible to people afterwards. And so perhaps we could begin tonight, perhaps by saying, first of all, just tell us where you've come from this evening.
This evening we've come down from Pembrokeshire, my wife and I. We worship at Pennuel Chapel in Roach. If you're ever down in Pembrokeshire, do come and see us. We live about 10 miles north of Haverfordwest.
And Roach is that little place which, if you blink, you more or less pass through it, isn't it? On the way to St. David's.
You will usually miss Roach when you're on your way to Newgale Beach, which is just down below it, and is a beautiful long beach.
Yeah. And it is a beautiful part of the world that you live in, isn't it?
Oh, really fabulous! Yes, yeah.
Great. So, are you working at the moment? Are you?
Yes, I'm working part-time, in theory, running a small charity which supports farmers in crisis in West Wales. Nice. So that covers the 3 counties of Dyfed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're quite busy with that, even though it's part-time, I imagine.
We are busy, and we have a team of really good volunteers who are out and about all the time helping with the farmers, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Gareth, I know a bit about your story. I guess a lot of folks don't know so much here, but to begin your story tonight, it takes place it starts in a place which in some ways has become iconic in Wales, hasn't it?
It has. You're probably aware I was born and brought up in the village of Aberfan, which I have since found on my travels around the UK, and if ever I was overseas as well, and anybody found out, everybody knew the name of Aberfan, and it kind of sticks there. And as with much in my story, I'm always slightly surprised that people kind of pay so much attention to it, because of course it was my life, so I've got nothing to compare it with. It's just where I was brought up. But of course there was an event there which made it rather different to most places, yes.
Yeah. So tell us, first of all, growing up in Aberfan, Valleys Village, early memories, what would they be like for you?
Very, very few memories of anything before my 5th birthday, but anything before I was aged 5. I suppose it was just a normal upbringing. I had a very good home. I was brought up with loving parents, a loving mother and father, a brother and a sister, both older than me, and it was a very nice and comfortable home, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Father was a coal miner. Mother spent time as a nurse and a time working in a shop when we were little. Mm-hmm. So it was a very, I suppose you'd say, normal family upbringing.
Yeah. And then obviously that normal family upbringing was suddenly shattered one day.
Yeah. I'd started school in the September, and it was then in the October that the disaster happened. Which interesting, I've just noted on the way down today the date. It's the anniversary again in just over a week's time. So yes, it'll be 53 years ago then that the disaster happened, and that was. It seems rather small to say that was a life changer. That was a huge event, not just in my life, but in the life of the village. Because of the magnitude of it. If you think of a school of 240 pupils and 116 died, that's all but half. And then after that, a number of families very quickly left the area. So another load left as well. Right. So we were left in the village, those of us who remained, as a village without many children.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of your own recollection of that day,
yeah,
what would you be able to tell us this evening, Zoe?
I don't know what you remember about your 5th birthdays. I mean, you can probably remember your 5th birthdays, but it was such a long time ago. Yeah, age 5, I don't remember in the same way as I remember last week, or some of it. But what I do have is like black and white postcard memories. I remember certain pictures of things that happened during the day. I remember coming out of the school. I remember being in my mother's arms and she was wading through slurry to get us away from there. I remember the sounds of the day. The most vivid thing is the sounds I remember. Right. There are snapshots. It's not like a whole movie. It's not like a whole film. It's snapshots that I remember of the day. Yeah. And it's not memories that I try to remember, and I've not actively tried to forget either, but they are there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. For many people, that was a bit of a defining moment.
Yeah.
And as you say, wherever you've gone, and people have found out you're from Aberfan, there's that immediate connection. 5 years old, very impressionable. It must have made a mark on you, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose what's different today in the UK today is that if something of a magnitude happens, then there's an awful lot of support that clicks into place. There's an awful lot of counselling. There's an awful lot of process that survivors will go through in order to help them with that survival. I remember nothing of that happening at Aberfan. There was no counselling. There was no team of people coming in to help the survivors. There were teams of people digging. There were teams of people clearing stuff away. But the survivors got on with their own lives. And that was very much the reaction as I perceived it, and reflecting back on it now was just get on with it. Just get on with it. There's work to be done, just get on with it. And I don't know if I leap ahead here, but I will say that what was evident to me and became increasingly is that nobody ever talked about the Aberfan disaster in Aberfan. Indeed, it was the 50th anniversary just a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember all the stuff on television about it. I recorded it all, and I've still got it. I haven't watched it yet.
Right.
It's still there.
Okay.
I will watch it one day, I'm sure, but it is still there. But around the time of the 50th anniversary, my mother was down staying with us in Pembrokeshire.
Right.
And I thought, you know what? We've never, ever spoken about this with my mother.
Right.
So I'm going to speak to her about it now. And I asked her then, 50 years later, what her recollections of the day were.
Right.
And I almost regretted asking.
Yes.
Because she told me.
Uh-huh.
And
yes.
it was difficult.
Yes.
It was difficult to hear because I hadn't thought of it from the perspective of a mother of all the children being lost.
Yes.
And that was hard.
Yes.
But I suppose the fact that we hadn't spoken about it, not a word for 50 years, nor had I spoken with my brother, and we've never said a word about it, still to this day, nor with my sister, nor did I with my father.
Right.
So not a word in the family. And further, not a word with anybody else from Aberfan either.
Well.
So of all the people in the village, and it's a good size village, of all the people in the village, I've never had one conversation with anybody about Aberfan.
Right.
And that's not because I'm weird. It's because all of us were weird.
Right.
That was our conditioning.
Yes. I suppose in many ways, nothing like this had really happened before.
No.
So there is no way of preparing,
No.
knowing what to do. But what you're saying is that you, and I guess it was the same for many in the village, you just got on with it.
Yeah. But I do remember very clearly that I disliked the village
Right.
an awful lot from that time onwards. And from a very young age, I was plotting my escape. I was thinking, I'm going to get away from here as soon as I can.
Yeah. Even at 5 years old, you were...
Shortly afterwards.
Shortly
Afterwards, certainly, yes.
Okay.
That I was going to get away, that I didn't want to be there. And I wished, in many ways, that we were one of the families that had left the village after it. Because the village was full of either anger or sadness. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes a mixture of the two.
Yeah.
And there was little there that I enjoyed about the village.
Yeah.
And little things. We're in the heart of one of the greatest rugby playing towns in the world. And you think of rugby in Wales and they're synonymous, aren't they? Yeah. Aberfan didn't have a rugby team. All the villages had a rugby team. Aberfan didn't have a rugby team until I was 18 years old.
Right. Indeed.
And there's a reason for that.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Out of interest, were you ever in contact with church as a young child, or Christians?
We went to Sunday school for a while, but it was a youth club. I have no recollection of being told anything about the Bible or anything of that nature. It was a youth club, and we went there to meet and play with other kids. Yeah. And after a while, I remember my mother asking us if we wanted to go again, and we said no, so we didn't.
Right.
And that was it. So,
that was it.
Yeah.
So it was a fleeting connection.
It was a fleeting connection. It was a fleeting visit to youth club.
And that was it.
And that was it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were quite keen from a young age to escape Aberfan.
Yes.
Really, to get out.
Yes.
So how did that happen?
I went to university,
Right.
which was it was relatively unusual at the time. Not many people from the valley were going to university. Not many people from our school were going to university. Mm-hmm. There were a handful, and I was fortunate I was one of them.
Right.
I didn't get the startling grades that young students of today get, and I probably wouldn't have got in were it not for the fact that I'd spent most of my childhood in Aberfan after the disaster swimming.
Right.
They built a swimming pool there, and I quickly found out that I was a good swimmer.
Right.
So I spent 4 or 5 hours a day with my face in water, so I didn't have to speak to anybody else. It's not how I saw it at the time, but it's quite clear since.
Yes.
And I became a good level swimmer. So when I went for an interview to go to university, they asked me if I'd carry on swimming. Yeah. I said yes, and they gave me a place.
Great.
And suited me. So yes, I went to university in Aberystwyth.
Right.
Yeah.
And what did you go to study at Aber?
I went to study law. Any lawyers here? Anybody studied law?
Yes,
there is?
Rebecca.
Oh. At Aber. Sorry. Law was so boring. I changed after just a few weeks and I did economics.
All right, okay.
Much more fun.
Great. But moving from Aberfan to Aberystwyth, that was another big moment in your life.
Yes, it should have been a big moment in my life because I was leaving home. It was the day I left home. I was recently turned 18, and it was my escape, my long-planned escape. But it didn't quite go according to plan. Mm-hmm. And you must forgive me if I'm a bit croaky, firstly because I have a cold, or I'm getting over a cold, but secondly because this is sometimes quite an emotional story.
Right.
Went to university, and in those days we didn't have a car. My father took us up, my mother and father took me up and dropped me off. And they lingered around for ages, as they do, checking you've got everything and you're happy, and you're pushing them into the car. And eventually I managed to push them, I think, all the way out of the town and went out. And when I came back in after a couple of hours, there was a telephone message that my parents had had a car crash on the way home. Right. And my father was dead.
Yes.
So the escape didn't go to plan.
No. Huge trauma.
Massive.
Again, another trauma.
Massive.
Unexpected.
Yeah.
Devastating.
Yeah.
And again, 18 is still a very vulnerable age, isn't it?
It was, and I think the timing was very relevant, because it had been a plan of mine to get away for such a long time, and here I was on the day of gaining this independence, and everything changed in the wrong way. So I went home, or I went as far as Brecon, where my mother was in hospital for some weeks. And I said I wouldn't go back to university, but she insisted. So I went back weeks later, having missed the first few weeks of term, which then made me that odd kid who, where's he come from? All the friendships and everything have been formed, and suddenly there's this new face in the crowd. And some people were hearing whispers of a story and sort of, tiptoeing around me and what have you. But it was a very difficult period. Yes.
So, how did you cope with this that had happened to you?
I didn't know how to cope. I didn't have any idea how to cope. So, not as a plan, I got drunk. And I'd been an athlete. I didn't drink much as a kid, so this was a new thing for me. So I got drunk, only the once, but for 4 years. And I drank heavily every day of my university life, heavily.
So that basically was your coping mechanism at that time?
I suppose that's what you'd call it, yeah. I'm not sure how much coping was done, but it was a mechanism, yes. But yeah, I reacted poorly.
Okay, yeah. I mean, again, big life events, sometimes people think about faith, think about God. Were you...
There were a few people that I'd speak to about it, and not many. But there was one guy I spoke with, and he said, why don't you go to church? Why don't you go to church and see if you get some comfort there? And I thought, well, why not? Give it a shot, give it a go. If there's help there, yes. And I went to a church randomly chosen in Aberystwyth, and I went in on a Sunday. And if you imagine, I walked in at the back there, and people turned round and they went, and they looked me up and down, and I sat at the back, and I thought, okay, and waited until the end of the service. And as I left at the end of the service, nobody said a word. Nobody asked who I was. Nobody, just like this place, really. You come in and nobody said a word. And okay, I wouldn't have looked great. Yeah, okay, sure. I would have been hungover on that day, as I was every other day, and I wouldn't have looked great. But I was there because somebody had said I might find hope or something, and what I found was what I translated as hostility. Yeah. And that reinforced the fact that God wasn't present in my life, and set the scene, I think, on reflection, set the scene for my subsequent decision, my subsequent rationalization for the fact that I was an atheist.
Right. Yeah. So was it about that time that your atheistic conviction sort of crept in?
No, it developed. It developed for some time after that. I didn't really give it a lot of thought that I can remember at the time, other than the fact that church wasn't for me, that it isn't a welcome place, that there's nothing there to offer me or help me or interest me. So it was an indifference, perhaps, or worse than that.
Yeah. So despite the fact you were drinking quite heavily through university, you still managed to graduate? Yes.
I didn't do great in my A-levels, but because I was a great swimmer, I got in, so that was terrific. And I didn't do particularly well in my degree, but I graduated and I got a teaching qualification after that as well. So, right. I suppose it's because I was so clever I didn't need to be sober.
So did you enter the teaching profession?
I did. Any teachers in the room? Surely. Okay, right. Yes, I did. I spent about 2.5 years as a teacher. Right. You will know that if you're not a teacher, if you're not a called teacher, you can't teach just as a job. It has to be a career. And I did it for about 2.5 years, and I couldn't imagine doing it for another 32 and a half or whatever it was. So I moved on.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what did you move on to?
I moved into what is today grandly called financial services. At the time, it was the life assurance industry. And it was both a sales job and a training job, so employing my teaching skills, if you like, in that industry.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and in terms of your own personal life,
Yeah.
as you sort of move on
Yeah.
after uni,
Yeah.
without being too intrusive, you know.
Oh, intrude,
how
intrude.
how was life for you?
It was fine. When I was teaching, I'd met a girl, and everybody around us was sort of pairing up and getting married, and we paired up and got married.
Right.
So that all happened very quickly, and seemed the thing to do. So yeah, everything was looking rosy.
So yeah, you sort of kind of got it together then. You got through the trauma.
Well, as soon as I got the job as a teacher, I
Yeah.
sobered up.
Right, of course.
That was that, you know, kind of that day.
Yeah.
I didn't drink then. I was working. It was a profession. I got married. I had a relationship. So everything was great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Only didn't quite go according to plan.
Right. Okay.
We'd met and married very quickly, and she quickly fell pregnant as well. And that was a shock to the system. Wasn't expected. And we had a son.
Right.
And I know there's parents in the room. And you know, when you have a child, you invest heavily in that child. You know, it becomes such a massive focus of your life. And that all happened. That all happened to me as well, which was par for the course. Except that I then found out that the son wasn't mine, that my wife had been having an affair, and that the marriage was over. So that didn't quite go according to plan either.
Right.
And the father was on the scene, and they were getting together, and there were court proceedings to change the birth certificate, and I was out of the picture. So having thrown all the emotion that you do into a child,
Yes.
for that then to be taken away was another difficult period, shall we say.
Very traumatic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you mind me asking how you coped at that time?
Anybody want to guess? I got drunk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that day, actually.
Right.
And every day thereafter, pretty much. I was still working, but it was this was the 80s. The 80s had a particular culture around it, which wasn't particularly appealing. I was in the centre of Cardiff. I lived in the centre of Cardiff. I was walking distance to the office. Everybody or somebody wanted to go out for a drink after work every night. It may not be the same people, but I was always there.
Right.
It was very easy to do.
Yeah.
And it was masking. I reckon by now I was an adult. You know, I was a bit more grown up. I was a bit more experienced, and I recognised that I was masking it at the time. But bring it on.
Yeah.
It was a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people find work is a coping mechanism as well. Was that your experience?
To a degree, perhaps. That becomes more relevant a little later in the story.
Okay.
But at that time, I wasn't particularly career-minded. So there was a couple of years where it was quite just survival. Later, though, a colleague and I had a business idea. So we were working in this life assurance industry, and we had a business idea, which was quite an odd idea. But we were, if you think of it, we were selling life assurance to people, or we had a team. I was managing a team by then, managing this team of people who were going out selling life assurance to people. And they would ask, do you have a will? And I'm not going to ask the question here because I don't want to embarrass you, but you'd ask the question, do you have a will? And most people would say, no. And it was kind of, well, why do you want to buy life assurance if you don't even know who you want to give your money to? So myself and a business partner had this idea, and we set up a will writing business.
Right.
Yeah, And it was incredibly well received, and it grew at a really rapid rate. It became the biggest will writing company in the country very, very quickly.
Right.
And I was 31 years old, and I ran that business, which was really a roller coaster. And at that stage, life was looking very, very good.
So the business was doing well. Presumably you were employing people?
Yeah, we had, if I remember right, it was about 22 people,
Right.
some based in the office, a lot of reps out on the road, company cars, all this
Right.
kind of stuff. It was very, very fast-paced. I was all over the country, speaking in all sorts of different places and having meetings at board level and all this. It was exciting. It was really, really exciting. Yeah.
And in terms of your personal life, how were things?
It was, at that time, it was work.
Right.
There were relationships, but it was work.
Yeah.
I was too busy for too much. I was working very hard and enjoying it and still partying, but I was more sober.
Okay.
I wasn't then drunk every night.
Yeah.
So
So the business went from strength to strength.
the business went from strength to strength until.
Right.
I don't want to say that we didn't make any mistakes. We did, and I'm sure we could have done things differently. But there was an act passed, the Financial Services Act, and the intention of the act was essentially to stop somebody saying, "Well, we'll sell you some double glazing, but it's okay. You don't have to pay for it. We'll remortgage your house to pay for it." Yeah, so you sell the double glazing and then you sell a mortgage and life assurance and everything else on the back of people wanting double glazing. So the government passed a law to outlaw that, which was right. But the way they worded it was to say that you couldn't sell any non-regulated products. And the way we were going to market was we were using the life assurance sales teams of all these different companies to sell our product, which was not regulated. So immediately, overnight essentially, when the Act came into force, they had to stop selling our product. So from doing thousands of wills, we couldn't do any. And we went to the financial services body at the time, Loutra it was called, and asked them to regulate us. And they wouldn't. So we went to the Law Society, and we asked them to regulate us. And they wouldn't, because we weren't lawyers. So we couldn't become regulated. So our channel of distribution, the sales force essentially, was gone. So the business went bust very quickly, as in within a couple of weeks.
Right.
And we had to make redundant all of the team and break all the leases on the car and the office and the this and the that and then the debt that comes from it and the personal guarantees that you've put into it, and the house is repossessed and your car is repossessed, and from having, not wanting to be flash, I had 2 houses and 2 cars because I needed them all. And they'd all went in weeks. Gone. And again, not blameless, but at the time, from a very, very high in terms of business to this damned act being passed.
Yeah.
And we're a victim of it.
Yeah.
And that wasn't great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another big crash, really, for you.
Another big crash for me, yes.
Yeah. How did you cope with that?
Any guesses?
Yeah.
No, I didn't. See, the only person who asked it, no, I didn't. No. I couldn't afford to.
Right. Okay.
But I did have a friend who used drugs.
Right.
And guess what? They're so much cheaper than alcohol.
Right.
So I got stoned.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
For years.
Right.
Many years. There is, I don't know how aware of it you are, but there is a real drugs problem in this country amongst what you'd call the professional classes. People who are seemingly holding down great jobs and working very hard and in responsible positions.
Yeah.
And there are so many of them using drugs. Recreational drugs, they're called, isn't it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Not sure quite how recreational it was, but there's so many people using drugs. And I fell into that category. I fell into that very easily Very good friends of mine at the time, really, really good friends, and I'd see them every night. And we would use drugs every night.
Right. Yeah. And again, realistically, this was your way of dealing with the hurt inside.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Again, it wasn't a planned coping mechanism.
Yeah.
It wasn't even recognised at the time, I don't think, as a coping mechanism, but it was what I turned to.
Yeah.
And if I'm honest, it was kind of turning to type, wasn't it? You know, it was predictable, I suppose. Yeah.
But already from your story, we're seeing, in a way, you're a survivor.
Yeah, well, in the same way that I didn't need to study for a degree and I could get a degree, I was that bright and that clever and that great that, I'd just get through it anyway, couldn't I? And that was how I went through life.
Nice.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Seriously, that's how I went through life. That, I could cope with anything. Look at what I've coped with so far. So very much bring it on. But at the same time, I will still set up a business. I will still get a job. I will still do stuff. And that was what I became. That was who I was. I was this guy who could cope with anything. So bring it on. Yeah.
That began to change, though.
Not for a while.
No.
I started a new career. I got married again.
Right.
That was terrific. Got married again, got a new job, and began to be quite successful again. And was settled down quite happy. But that didn't go quite according to plan either.
Right, okay.
We'd been married a couple of years, and my wife sat down with me one day and told me she was having an affair and was leaving. So that also came as something of a surprise. I don't know, is it something about me that, it's... but seriously, it's... When you've been divorced once and you get married again, you don't do it lightly and you think you're doing the right thing. And it was a shock, again, to have this happen again to me. I will say, okay, that third time is fantastic, okay?
It's lovely to have Vanessa with us this evening.
Did I get away with that? But it was at that time, after that marriage, that I did the throw myself into work thing.
Right.
I didn't really get drunk after that, because actually I was still using drugs at that time.
Right.
So I didn't need to. But then I threw myself into work and began working very long hours and working very hard. I had a wonderful job title. I worked as a headhunter, which is so much better than a lawyer, isn't it? I worked as a headhunter. I was doing senior level recruitment work, really senior level stuff. So I was mixing daily with chief executives and chairmen and managing directors and this kind of thing. And it was terrific. It was a really, really great career to be in, and I loved it and worked very, very hard at it. But I was still using drugs.
Right.
And that all changed. When would it be? About 2007. Yeah, about 2006-07, when two things around that time, within a year or two, happened in my life. The first, we've already introduced Vanessa. Vanessa came into my life, and that offered me something else, something new, some hope. And secondly, I changed businesses. I'd been with this one firm of headhunters for many years, and I was in turn headhunted to another firm of headhunters, which is now sounding a bit ridiculous. But it was like going from Division 2 to Division 1, right. Yeah, or even a bigger step. The people who recruited me were really one of the sort of the Premier League, then, shall we say, of headhunters. And that was really something. So with a new relationship and a new home and a new job, I stopped taking drugs.
Right.
Drank, but just like, you know,
Social.
normal, social, glass of wine type of thing, and worked hard and became a lot better, surprisingly, because I was sober. So yes, that was quite a change. Yeah.
Now, am I right? Well, I'm just fascinated how you ended up in Pembrokeshire.
So, one of the contracts that I was brought in to run. Do you remember devolution? And we got the Welsh Assembly. Okay. Well, the Welsh Assembly then needed in turn the Welsh Civil Service, and of course we didn't have one. So the company that recruited me had won the contract to recruit the first Welsh Civil Service. Yeah? Right. So I joined them to run that contract out of Cardiff and set up a Cardiff office. Right. Okay? So I was working in Cardiff, but I was also doing a lot of work out of the head office, which was in London. Okay? Then, with public contracts, you can't have them forever. They come to an end and they have to be retendered and they go elsewhere. Right. So that contract ended, so I was London focused. But we closed the Cardiff office and they made us home-based. Okay, so I was working essentially out of London, but my base was at home. And home can be anywhere, can't it? Mm-hmm. And we used to holiday down in West Wales. And we'd go down for a week or a weekend in a caravan or a B&B for a couple of nights or whatever. And we loved West Wales. And one day we were on our way home from we'd been down for a week in a little place in West Wales near Llangrannog, in a little cottage. And Vanessa said, is there any way we can switch this around? That we could live down here and you can go back to Cardiff when you need to, because it's so lovely down here. And I thought, I wonder. And we thought it through. We actually went to the pub and I took a piece of paper and drew a line down the middle with plus on one side and minus on the other side. And I can see all the blokes nodding and all the women going. And that's what we did. And we just wrote this long list of pluses. Yes. Yeah, and pretty much there were two minuses. One was, would we miss our friends? Well, we were moving to Pembrokeshire, we can't get rid of them. And the other was my journey, because I had to go to London every week. And I thought, well, if I can cope with the journey, we can actually live in Pembrokeshire. So we sold up in Cardiff and moved to Pembrokeshire.
Great.
Yeah, but I was still doing the weekly commute up to London and staying a night or two every week and working up there, which was tiring.
Yes.
It was terrible going up at, I don't know, leaving the house at 10 to 5 in the morning to catch the train and what have you, but it was lovely coming home.
So you probably had an eye at some point of thinking, well, it'd be great one day to give up this job or finish the job and just settle down here and enjoy life together as a couple. Yeah,
it came a bit out of the blue. I mean, I'd been one of these people who said, oh, I'm never going to retire, I'm never going to stop working, because I loved it so much. But it was taking its toll. It was hard, and I recognized afterwards how hard it had been. But an opportunity came up to go with redundancy. And we sat down and worked out the numbers, because we still had mortgages and stuff, and worked out the numbers, and then we worked them out again. And on about the 85th time of working it out, we still couldn't afford for me to retire. But if Vanessa carried on working, we could survive. And I thought, what a great idea. What a terrific solution. So that's what we did. So that's what I did.
Right.
And I retired.
Right.
About 5 years ago now. Yeah.
So you retired and Vanessa carried on working?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. So everything was great with Vanessa?
Everything was terrific. I was having a ball. No, that was lovely. Yes. Yeah. It was on the brink of being spoiled again. Forgive me for referring to it, but Vanessa had a health scare. Right. Which was looking pretty serious, and tests. And each test was leading to another test, and I'm sure many of you have been in this position. But when she went for the results of the final test, they were all clear.
Right.
And that was fantastic, because we really weren't expecting it to be clear. And whereas I was an atheist, okay, and during this process, with these things happening and my reaction and all the rest, I had really entrenched my position as an atheist.
Yeah.
Okay, I was an arguing atheist, I would call myself.
Tell us a bit more about that. What does that mean? You just basically enjoyed a good argument.
I've always enjoyed a good argument.
Right,
I still do. If anybody's got one later, okay. Seriously, I've always enjoyed a good argument, and I see an argument as sometimes as an intellectual challenge.
Right.
Yeah. And I actually believed, and I find it absurd to say it now, that I actually believed that if I argued long enough with a Christian, I could talk him out of it.
Right.
Okay, because this nonsense, it's built on all this myth, yeah, and these fictional characters, and all right, there's great stories, but they made up.
Right.
And that was my approach, and I had all sorts of arguments to back that up.
Right.
Yeah, I'd used them a couple of times, but I'd rehearsed them to myself endlessly, and it was my belief. It was my belief. It was my position on all of this, that I'm an atheist, not an agnostic.
Right.
Agnosticism doesn't actually make sense to me.
Just explain for any folks the two terms, agnostic, atheist.
Well, agnostic to me means that you kind of think that maybe there is something there, but I'm not really sure which lot is right.
Yes.
Yeah? Atheism is there is no God.
Right.
There is no God of any description. They're all wrong.
Yes.
They're all, frankly, nutters.
Yes.
Yeah? There is no God.
So
I was an atheist.
You were convinced of this.
Yeah.
And you almost sound like an evangelist for atheism.
Yeah, I suppose. There's not much call for it, but I suppose I was the closest thing you could imagine to it. Yes.
Yeah. One of the things I'm always curious about people who adopt this position in life. The question is, did you? I know you may have felt at the time it was intellectually satisfying, your atheism, but did you ever get a sense of peace through it? Or actually, could we use the word comfort?
I was comfortable.
Right.
You know the life I'd had, but I was now in a very good career and latterly retired. I had a lovely wife, and thankfully still do. I have a lovely home. I was very comfortable.
Yeah.
And I was very comfortable with the idea that, and I used to say, if I die tonight, I do so comfortable that I've given it a go.
Right.
That I've done what I could, that I've had a life. Yeah? And people would say, well, what do you want at your funeral? And I'd say, well, I don't care, I'll be dead. Throw me on a skip, doesn't matter, I'll be dead.
Right. Yeah.
And this made sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah? This made sense to me.
So obviously at some point this began to unravel, to be challenged.
Pick up the story again where Vanessa had been concerned that she was going to be unwell, and she wasn't. That's stating it all quite ridiculously small, but Ness had grown up in with a Christian faith.
Right.
Yeah, you don't mind me saying it. I'll probably state it wrong, but she believed in God. Yeah, but for the time that we'd been together, she hadn't been practicing it. She hadn't been to chapel. Yeah, but had that belief. At the time of this health scare, she really felt, or she knew, that God's hand had been on her.
Right.
Her mother is a Christian. There'd been prayer groups all over, and she came back and told me that God had had a hand in this. That she was going to go to chapel. She was going to find a chapel and go to chapel, and she was going to pick up her Christian faith and actually become a Christian, to commit to the Lord Jesus.
Right.
And I said, terrific, great. Absolutely marvellous. Knock yourself out. That's wonderful news for you.
Right.
Don't get the wrong idea. I'm an atheist.
Okay.
And she did, and she went out and she went to a few chapels, and then eventually found Penuel. Yep. It's a lovely. A couple of guys here have been there. Penuel is a lovely place and a lovely community, and Ness would go there every week and come home, and she'd be telling me about conversations with John and Renee and John and Chris and John and Phil, and you've got Matthew here, yeah? We got John in Penwell.
Yeah, we have a lot
It'll
of
make
Matthews.
sense to a lot of you.
A lot of Matthews here.
And she said one day, and I think it was around Easter time, it was kind of a special servicey time, and she said, why don't you come and meet my friends? And I'm a sociable kind of guy, so I said, of course I will, but don't get any ideas, because I'm an atheist. And I went along and I met them, and they were really, really welcoming. I mean, a really nice bunch of people. But interestingly, I also listened to a sermon for the first time in my life. I was this, like 54 years of age, and I listened to the first sermon in my life. And it was really good. Yeah, Ian Middlemist. You probably know Ian, yeah? It was really, really good. It was really interesting. It was a great story. It was a story. It was a made-up story, but it was really interesting. So I enjoyed the people. I enjoyed the cake. There was lots of cake. And a couple of weeks later, I went back. Vanessa asked me to go along again. I went back again, and I listened to another sermon with another guy preaching, and I ate more cake, and we chatted again, and it's really interesting because there's a pair of twin brothers there, yeah, identical twins. One supports the Scarlets, the other supports Ospreys. How does that happen?
Yes, how does that happen?
I don't know. You know, the same genes. I mean, but I really enjoyed the company again, and that was about that.
So it was all very comfortable on that level.
Yeah.
Sort of just enjoy it. And
it was nice people and cake.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it came to the summer, and I now know that every year there's a mission team comes over from Mississippi in the US.
Right.
A little town called, confusingly, French Camp.
Right.
Yeah, and they come over from a school, French Camp Academy, to Haverfordwest as missionaries.
Right.
Which always makes me laugh, a mission to Haverfordwest. Have you been there? I now know they come over every year, but they'd come over and they'd spend some time, and they were having a barbecue at Penwell in Roach on the field next to the chapel. And Ness said, oh, why don't you come to the barbecue and meet our American friends? I thought, barbecue? Americans? Yeah. And I went. And something interesting happened.
Okay.
Now, bear in mind, they didn't know who I was or my background or the fact that I was an atheist or the fact that I was this structured thinker and arguer or anything of that nature. Yeah? But we had the barbecue and it was all lovely. And then the leader of the mission, one of the teachers from out there, Dennis, said, Ryan, say a few words. And he actually told the story of the Bible from start to finish in, about 20 minutes? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
It's like a Bible overview.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely, from start to finish. And I'd never heard the story of the Bible before.
Right.
Yeah? And it's a fascinating story. And I thought, wow, that's really amazing. What a yarn, what a tale, you know? Wow, they should make a film of this. You know, it was really, really, it was striking.
Right.
So I went up to him afterwards and we were having a chat about it, and he said, well, if you like that, come along in a couple of nights' time, and I'm doing a presentation, like a lecture, on how the Bible was written. Right. Okay? So I thought, that's got to be interesting. So I went along and we sat in like the equivalent of that room out there, you know, with cake. And Dennis did a presentation with PowerPoint and everything, you know, it really appealed to me. And he told us how the Bible had been written. And I'll get this all wrong, but it was like the idea that it had been written by over 40 separate people over the course of 1,500 years. Yeah? And that it told one story which is flawless. Yeah. That since it has been written, scholars and academic scholars of all descriptions have tried their very best to find fault with it. Yeah, for thousands of years, and haven't found a single fault yet. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. You know, maybe these scholars just weren't bright enough. You know, give me another look. But in seriousness, it struck me. And it was sort of the question was on my lips. If we tried to write a story like that today, with email and mobile phones and internet, we'd still get it wrong. We'd still muck it up. Even if we managed to sit in the same room and devise a plot together, we still couldn't do it. And I began to have doubts about my position.
About your atheism?
Yes. And it was quite unwelcome. And it was quite difficult because, bearing in mind, this structured, arguing, logical person who really liked himself, really loved himself, had got through all this stuff because he's so great. And suddenly I was reflecting on the idea that I might be wrong. And I didn't do wrong.
Right.
Wrong didn't sit easily. But I might be wrong. So I started going a little bit more often to chapel. And I started listening a little more. And talking not just about rugby, but perhaps about other things as well. And then, a couple of days, I'll mention one. There was one Sunday morning when we woke up and Vanessa had a headache. And she couldn't go to chapel. And I went.
On your own?
On my own.
First time since Aberystwyth?
First time since, I was going to say ever, but since Aberystwyth, I walked into a chapel on my own.
Right.
And that actually told us both something. I'd always gone because I'd gone with Vanessa. I'd always gone because Vanessa had asked me to go. But for some reason, Vanessa couldn't go, and yet I was going. But then a second thing happened, a couple of weeks probably after, I forget the timeline, but probably a couple of weeks afterwards. And we were in chapel, and I'd often sung the hymns, who doesn't like a good sing-song? But I'd never really sung the words, yeah? But we were singing To God Be the Glory.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful old hymn. Probably still my favourite, probably always will be. And in the second verse says, the vilest offender who truly believes. That moment from Jesus,
yes,
a pardon receives.
Yes.
And I struggle to say the words now. I couldn't say them then.
Right.
I couldn't sing them. And I was crying. Much as I am now. I was crying, and I'm not the kind of guy who I always laugh and say I didn't cry at the end of Bambi. Right. I'm not given to emotional outbursts, but I was crying, right. And I couldn't sing those words.
Yeah. So something had penetrated your defenses, your worldview, your sense of self-confidence, and it touched you profoundly deeply.
I think it's more specific than that.
Come on.
It was about me.
Right. Right.
I recognise that those words were about me, that I was the vilest offender.
Yes. And
my vilest offence is that for decades I had told God he didn't exist.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty horrible thing to do. And yet the next line is,
yeah,
that moment, if you believe, if you truly believe, that moment, you get a pardon from Jesus.
Yeah.
And that is just an overwhelming message. It's an overwhelming fact.
Indeed.
And it all came together kind of in that moment, I suppose, that I was wrong. I'd lived my life wrong. And I needed a pardon. I needed somebody to pardon me.
So really you came face to face with two things. One was who you were, who you really were before God, and the other was Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me, if I may, yeah?
Please.
Let's take a step back for a moment and reflect as the old me. Okay, if you reflect as the old me, that I went through the Aberfan disaster and I got through that, and I became a swimmer. Yeah, and I was great, and I got to university, and I got drunk, but regardless of that, I got my degree. So, terrific, yay me. And then, my father dying, then my first marriage breaking down, and a child being lost, and all this kind of stuff. And, I drank, but I still got through it, and I set up a business, and that became a successful business. And then the business crashed, and I got through that, and I got a successful career again. And wow, how great I am at surviving, how wonderful I've been at getting through these things and picking myself up and getting on and doing it again. Yeah, and that's how I lived my life. Then this happened. Yeah, then this happened, and my eyes were opened. Okay, the scales fell from my eyes, if you like.
Yes.
And I look back at my life, and I wasn't great. I wasn't great. I was a mess. I'm reminded of something from this morning. Okay, we had Alan Davidson from Carmarthen speaking with us this morning in Pennuel, and he was talking about how you respond to things. And I was walking the dogs afterwards. I do a lot of my thinking when I'm walking with the dogs, yeah. And I was walking the dogs afterwards, and I was thinking about this evening, and about my response to things. And my response to Aberfan, to my father dying, to my marriage breaking up, to the business going bust, my response at each of those stages was awful. It was the worst possible response you could think of. I isolated myself. I got drunk. I went on to drugs. I did all these terrible things and all the things that go with it. My life was a mess. It was a series of chaotic episodes. Anything but great. And once my eyes were opened, I recognized very, very, very clearly that I was rescued from Aberfan. Yeah. And I was rescued from drunkenness at Aberystwyth. And I was rescued from drunkenness after my divorce. And I was rescued from drugs. And I mean rescued because, it's a pretty well-trodden path, alcoholism and drugs. It's a well-trodden path to not sitting here, but in a pretty horrible place. But I was rescued time and time and time and time again. And then I was saved.
Right.
Rescued and saved are synonymous. You can interchange them. You can use them in place of each other.
Yeah.
Except here.
Yes.
I was rescued time and time again because God had his hand on my life. And he had his hand on my life, and he was probably looking down and laughing at me and saying, not yet. Not yet, but one day. And then I was saved.
Yeah.
And then I laughed too.
Yeah.
Because I recognized it.
Yeah.
God had his hand on me throughout all of that messed up, crazy, stupid life, and brought me to that moment 3 years ago when I was born again.
Wonderful. Wonderful. For any folks who are here tonight, who might say, for example, well, Gareth, it's a very powerful story, and it's obviously very, very real in your experience. But if they were to say to you tonight, what is it about Jesus that just has made the difference in your life? Why is Jesus so special?
Wow. That's a big question, isn't it? That's a big question. We can all look back at our lives and we can all identify things we've done wrong and things we wish we hadn't done. But that's not the size of sin. I mean, sin is much bigger than that. We're all sinning all of the time. And even since you become a Christian, or since I've become a Christian, guess what? I still sin.
Yes.
But Jesus, who is, I don't want to get theological because I'm a novice at this, but Jesus is God.
Yes.
Jesus chose to come to earth as a man, amongst all these sinners. So perfect Jesus comes to earth as a man to live amongst sin and never committed a sin in his life. But everybody around him was committing sin. And nobody could do anything about this. We're all sinners and we're all destined to continue to be sinners. But Jesus took all of my sin every single sin that I've ever committed, and those that I will go on to commit, and he took them all on himself, and he paid the price for every one of my sins, and calls me his brother, and made me a joint inheritor of his, so that I could be saved. And yours, and yours, and yours, and yours, and everybody who asks him to. Is that special enough?
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And that is the wonder, isn't it, of the Christian hope. The Christian gospel. That's why we call it the gospel, the good news.
Well, there's a word which I never remember using in 54 years of my life. I never remember using the word joy.
Right.
And then suddenly I found myself using the word joy all the time. Special word, special meaning to me.
Okay.
I now experience joy in my life. I was comfortable before. I had comfort. I had material comforts. I had emotional comfort. I had no spiritual comfort because I didn't have room for it. I didn't want it. I now have joy and salvation and certainty.
So this is far more than just someone discovering religion, far more than just a different worldview, different idea on life, self-help, something like that.
I mentioned to somebody earlier, Jeff, I think it was, if he's in here, people used to talk about born-again Christians, and I used to think, oh, spare me. I was born 3 years ago. We were baptized 2 years ago.
Wonderful.
Outdoors in Penwell. Best day of my life. One of the first days of my life. We were born again. And my life hasn't changed. My life is new. My life is different. And I am different. So,
We were reminded in church this morning a lovely verse in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul actually speaking about the very kind of experience that you've shared with us this evening. If anyone is in Christ Jesus, they become a new creation. The old has gone, and the new has come. And this is why I think evenings like tonight are really, really important. We're so grateful to you, Gareth, and we realise to talk about these things isn't easy. And we really, I think all of us here this evening, genuinely appreciate your openness and your honesty. But evenings like this are so important because we're reminded that the hope that is on offer, as you say, for all of us in Jesus Christ isn't just a kind of empty hope, but it is something that literally changes lives.
Absolutely, and if there are any here who are not Christians, I would just ask you to look back on your life and think about events in your own lives and just think, might there have been God present at that time? Might that have been not me or coincidence or good luck or good fortune or because I touched wood or crossed my fingers? Might it have been something to do with God? And just see if you can identify God in the past in your lives and think about him. Because he's there.
And as you said, he is good.
Oh yeah.
He's good and generous and kind and compassionate. Well, I know you know at some point you're going to be heading home, but is it fair to say we're sort of around if people want to chat to you or Vanessa as well?
Yeah, we're not rushing off. Yeah, please, anybody who wants to, just going to have a chat with Vanessa. It's no, absolutely. Stick around if anybody wants to ask any questions. I'm happy to do what I can. So, yeah.
And because Gareth likes Llanelli so much, he's actually agreed to come back on November the 1st. One of the things we do as a church, we run first Thursday in the month up at Costa in Park Pemberton. We run what we call Cafe Church. And again, it's an evening of... Well, I was going to say it's a bit like this. It's nothing like this. But in principle it is. It's an evening for folks who wouldn't normally come to church, to come to somewhere to hear something of the Christian message. And Gareth has very kindly agreed to come along and to speak to us on that occasion up at Costa. So put it in your diary, November the 1st, or if you had friends and you think might benefit from hearing Gareth's story, perhaps a slightly shortened version of it, on
I
that
could do a
occasion.
longer one if you want.
Great. The other thing to say before you go, we have this bilingual magazine which was produced this summer by the Evangelical magazine, the Evangelical Movement of Wales, Welsh side. Is that Holly? Have I got? It's simple. It's so simple. I'm sure I've got it wrong. But Holly, which I understand means ask. Great. Okay. So it is the same in English and in Welsh. Now the beauty about this magazine, Gareth, your story is in here.
I am in there, yes.
So genuinely, if tonight you've come along, you've heard something, you thought, I've never really heard anything like that. Take one of these. There's plenty in the entrance as you leave, and also there are other bits and pieces. We're just trying to be helpful to you tonight in perhaps considering Christianity, thinking through the claims of Jesus Christ. So we've got a lot of other little booklets there. Where is God when things go wrong? We've even got a DVD called Believable. All of this is free. It's on a table there. Nobody's going to ask you any questions. Take that, put it in your handbag, put it in your pocket, take it home, read it. But as we said at the beginning, we are so delighted to see you here this evening. Trust that you found Gareth's story. On a human level, it's very moving, but we trust as well that it might have touched you more deeply here this evening with that awareness that there is one who is greater than all of us, who is glorious and wonderful, and who changes lives. And you don't need to have gone through the ringer of life to discover just how wonderful he is. And he has come for us, and there is a God, and he loves you deeply, passionately, and intensely. And he sent his son Jesus, that by his life, death, and resurrection, we might come into joy. So thank you very much, Gareth, and thank you, Ness, for coming as well. To say you're not going to rush away at the end. So we'll shut things down there. And just to say, actually, we're having another one of these next month. We haven't had a living room for quite a while. And again, if you want to pop it in your diary, it'd be very different. This one, it's going to be different after tonight because you're unique.
Thank you.
November the 11th is Remembrance Sunday. It actually falls on the 11th this year. So we'll be having a remembrance service here in the morning. If you wish to join us, you'll be very, very welcome. But in the evening, we've invited a guy called Gareth Davies to come and speak. Now, Mark has served actually in the forces. He served with the SAS for 17 years, a sergeant major in the SAS. And he also has a very wonderful story of how in the midst of his military career, he came to know Jesus Christ. So we'll be meeting here in a few weeks on Remembrance Sunday in the evening. So again, if you've never been to anything like this, why not at least pop back on the 11th, same format, 5:30, coffee and cake, and then we'll be hearing from Gareth Davies. But thank you for coming, and thank you once again, Gareth, for being here tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.